There was a time when the internet felt completely different. There were no algorithms carefully deciding what was appropriate for you. No content warning appearing before every disturbing video. No parents getting notifications about what their kids were watching. And definitely, no YouTube Kids. Instead, if you were a teenager with a computer and an internet connection and absolutely nothing to do after school, you went looking for something entertaining. Maybe you wanted to play a stupid flash game. Maybe you wanted to watch a funny video. Maybe you wanted to see somebody get pranked. And sometimes, you accidentally found something you really wished you hadn't. For a lot of people who grew up online during the late 1990s and early 2000s, websites like Newgrounds and eBaum's World were some of the first places where they discovered just how strange the internet could be, and sometimes how disturbing. Because before YouTube became the giant it is today, there was an internet where the line between comedy, violence, horror, and genuine disturbing material was incredibly thin. Tonight, we're going back there, to the era of flash games, grainy videos, shock humor, and the horrifying realization that clicking a link from your friend could potentially change what you thought the internet was capable of. To understand this era, you had to remember what using the internet was actually like. Imagine sitting at the family computer in the early 2000s. There's probably a bulky CRT monitor sitting on the desk. The computer takes several minutes to start. You've connected through dial-up, or maybe you finally upgraded to broadband, and there isn't really a central place to find everything. There isn't TikTok. There isn't Instagram. YouTube hasn't even launched yet. So instead, you find websites. And once you discovered one that had games or videos, you could spend hours there. One of the biggest names was Newgrounds, and unlike many people remember, Newgrounds didn't actually begin some massive flash entertainment empire. It all roots back all the way to 1991 when Tom Fulp created a Neo Geo themed fanzine called Newground. In 1995 it became a website, and over the next several years it evolved into something that would become incredibly important to internet culture. Newgrounds eventually created an automated system allowing people to publish movies and games for others to watch, play, and rate. According to Newgrounds itself, this system launched in 2000 and made the site one of the earliest places where users could instantly publish their own games or movies. And this was revolutionary, because suddenly, we didn't have to work for a major video game company. You didn't need a television studio. You didn't need a record label. You could be some teenager sitting in your bedroom, make a flash animation, upload it, and potentially have thousands of people watching it. There was just one problem. When you give teenagers a place to create whatever they want, they're probably going to create some absolutely insane stuff. Newgrounds became famous for flash games and animation. Some were harmless, some were hilarious, and some were unbelievably dark. One of the most famous examples was Pico's School. Tom Fulp created the original game in 1999, and it was inspired by the subject of school shootings coming only months after the Columbine massacre. The game placed the killer in the school where classmates had been killed, and Pico had to fight the attackers. Even by today's standards, that's an incredibly dark concept. But in 1999, this was appearing on the website that teenagers could access from their bedroom. And that's the part what made early Newgrounds so infamous. It didn't necessarily feel like a traditional video game website. It felt like a place where the internet's strangest creators had been given a microphone. You could go from a silly cartoon to an incredibly violent flash game to something completely inappropriate, all within minutes. Newgrounds itself described its early identity as being associated with twisted games and edgy material, and that edginess became part of its identity. People weren't necessarily trying to make something beautiful. Sometimes the entire point was to make something shocking, something offensive, something that would make your friend turn around and say, "Dude, what the hell did you just show me?" And for teenagers, that was powerful because the internet gave young people something they didn't really have anywhere else. A place without adults standing over their shoulder, and a place where the rules seemed almost non-existent. Then there was another name that became practically synonymous with early internet culture. Founded in 2001 by eBaum's, eBaum's World became an entertainment site filled with viral videos, images, flash cartoons, games, memes, and user-submitted material. And if Newgrounds was heavily associated with flash games and animations, eBaum's World became one of those places where you could stumble into practically anything. Funny videos, pranks, stupid stunts, weird animation, crude humor, and videos that made you question why you had even clicked on them in the first place. The important thing to understand is that eBaum's World wasn't technically a dedicated gore or shock site. That distinction matters. There were websites that existed specifically to show graphic photos and videos. Rotten.com, for example, became notorious for images of death and human remains. Ogrish, launched in 2000, became known for graphic imagery involving accidents, war, terrorism, and death. Those sites were much closer to what we properly call shock sites. eBaum's World was different. It was mainstream entertainment that existed during a period when mainstream internet entertainment could be incredibly unfiltered, and that's what made it such an effective gateway. You didn't necessarily go there looking for something disturbing. You might have gone there looking for a funny video, then you clicked another, and eventually somebody sent you something with a title like, "You have to watch this," and you clicked. For many people, this was their real introduction to shock content. Not necessarily because they searched for it, but because someone else showed it to them. A friend, classmate, or an older sibling. Someone sitting beside you in a computer lab, and there was something almost ritualistic about it. Someone would tell you, "Don't watch this," which, of course, made you want to watch it even more. You'd sit there staring at the screen. The video would load. The quality would be terrible. Sometimes there was no context whatsoever, no warning or explanation. Just a few seconds of something disturbing happening, and then it was over. You'd sit there quietly, and somebody would laugh. Not necessarily because it was funny, but because they were uncomfortable. That was one of the strange psychological elements of early shock content. The person showing it to you wasn't always trying to traumatize you. Sometimes they were trying to prove something. "I can't handle this. I've already seen it. You won't be able to watch the whole thing." It became a challenge. Who could watch the worst video without looking away? Who could find the most disturbing image? Who could send the most disturbing link? And because the internet was still relatively young, there wasn't always an obvious boundary between fiction shock content and real-world violence. Sometimes you generally didn't know what you were looking at. Today, we're surrounded by content. If something horrible happens somewhere in the world, it can appear on your phone within minutes. But early internet shock content had a different feeling. It was harder to find, and because of that, finding it felt like discovering a secret. There were forums, message boards, personal websites, file sharing programs, and websites dedicated to collecting strange material. This was the era of the internet's so-called Wild West. And that's not just nostalgia talking. The lack of centralized moderation really did create an environment where bizarre and extreme content could spread. Even Newgrounds founder Tom Fulp later reflected on the early internet as a place with very few filters, where creators could push material toward being increasingly crazy, insensitive, or extreme. And Flash played a massive role. Flash allowed ordinary people to create animations and games that could run directly inside a web browser. That helped create an entire generation of independent internet creators. Some became famous. Some created characters and franchises that would eventually become legitimate commercial games. Others just wanted to see how far they could push things. And that's why Newgrounds is such an important part of internet history. It wasn't simply a website full of violent cartoons. It helped establish the idea that ordinary internet users could become creators themselves. That concept would eventually become the foundation for YouTube, social media, and the creator economy. Then, in 2005, YouTube arrived, and suddenly, the internet had something it didn't really have before: a centralized place for video. At first, YouTube wasn't the polished platform we know today. It was chaotic. People uploaded whatever they wanted. But over time, the platform became more organized, more commercial, more heavily moderated, and eventually, the internet started becoming safer for mainstream audiences. But something was lost, that feeling of not knowing what you were going to see. The early internet had mystery. You could click a link and find something hilarious or disturbing. There was no algorithm sitting there telling you exactly what you'd like next. You were exploring, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, and sometimes someone was leading you directly towards the worst thing you'd ever seen. So was eBaum's World and Newgrounds really shock sites? This is where the history gets interesting, because it's tempting to look back and say eBaum's World and Newgrounds were the original shock sites, but that's not quite accurate. Shock sites existed independently of them. Rotten.com had already been infamous in the late 1990s. Ogrish appeared around 2000. Other dedicated shock sites would follow. These websites were much more focused on graphic real-world material. Newgrounds and eBaum's World were broader entertainment platforms. But for a teenager discovering the internet in the early 2000s, the distinction probably didn't feel very important, because these sites could act as a gateway. You'd arrive looking for a game or a funny video, and suddenly you discover an entire different side of the internet. This is what makes this period so fascinating. The shock wasn't necessarily the website itself. The shock was realizing there were no walls. Today, we look back at websites like Newgrounds and eBaum's World with a strange mixture of nostalgia and disbelief. For some people, they represent the golden age of the internet, a time where websites felt personal, when people actually created bizarre things just because they could, when flash games could consume an entire afternoon, when sending your friend a link was basically the equivalent of saying, "You have to see this," but for others, these websites represented something much darker. They were part of a generation's first exposure to material they probably weren't emotionally prepared to see. And maybe that's the strangest thing about growing up during that era. The internet didn't slowly introduce you to disturbing content. Sometimes it threw you directly into it. One minute you're playing a ridiculous flash game, the next you were staring at something horrifying. And there was nobody there to tell you, maybe you shouldn't watch this. You simply clicked and watched. You learned something about the internet that you probably couldn't unlearn. Because before social media, before smartphones, before YouTube became the world's video library, there was another internet. A strange internet. A less controlled internet. An internet where the most disturbing thing imaginable might be sitting right next to the funniest video you'd ever seen. And for a lot of teenagers, Newgrounds and eBaum's World were the doorway. Not necessarily for the first shock sites, but for many, they were the first place you'd realize just how dark the internet could become. And once you opened that door, there is no telling what you'd find on the other side.